Hi, and welcome back to session number 4. Today we discuss learning. For a brief moment, let's take stock of where we are, so we don't lose sight of the big picture of what we are attempting to accomplish. So far, we have been looking at elements of the business game. First, we looked at the technology of language and the importance of understanding the difference between language for no action and language for action. Next, we focused on the request-promise process, since that is where you spend 70 to 80% of your day, and showed you a framework that allows for more effective workflow coordination of action. Then, last time, we delivered a map for what to do when you and your team face adversity in the workflow process, since breakdowns are an inevitable part of the game. Now we are going to shift our focus away from the game itself and put the focus on the players in the game, you and me. Today's topic marks the first step in that shift from the game of business to the players. So let's talk about players. And as we talk about players, we are obviously talking about people. And when talking about people, we are talking about creatures of habit. Some of the habits you employ have to do with how you create, establish, maintain, and preserve your identity in any of the communities in which you participate: work, family, church, sports team, etc. Those habits that relate to how you manage your identity, we call those your style, your natural way of playing in the game of business. As a quick aside, we need to clarify exactly what we mean by habit. Habits, in our estimation, have two elements. Number one, they are something you do over and over. And number two, they are something you don't even know that you do. A great definition here, if you think about it, is a habit is when your body takes over your mind. Think about those times when you have the experience of waking up and realizing that you are in a similar situation. That's an example of a habit. Your mind was disengaged. Now think about this. If we remove the second element of a habit, in other words, we make it something that you can see, is the action still a habit, or is it something else? Well, our claim is that if you can see you do something, it is no longer a habit. It becomes a choice. And our goal in this game of business is to give you more choices about how you manage your identity, not just have your style pull you along. A question you might be asking yourself at this point is he saying all my habits are bad? The answer to this question is, of course, no. Think about the 80-20 rule. You may have heard of it, the Pareto principle. It states that it's the first 20% of output that produces 80% of the benefit. The rule applies everywhere. To your revenue, where it's 20% of your clients that produce 80% of your revenues, as well as to your closet, where it's 20% of the clothes in there that get 80% of the wear. What's important about this rule as it relates to our conversation? Well, think about it this way. You have your identity, who you are in the minds of other people. And as it relates to your identity, there is 20% of what you do that produces 80% of the benefit. Conversely, there is 80% of what you do that produces only 20% of the benefit. Those are the habits we want to eliminate from your game, so that you can leverage the initial 20%, which of course we are going to claim is consistent with your style. As a final point of clarification, why is this important, you ask? Well, simple. Most people take an approach to accomplishment that wastes energy. Here is what we mean. If we were to graph your future out over time, measured in some form of accomplishment, money, job title, whatever, your vector would be going up. You are an already successful person. But if you are ambitious, you might be looking for more accomplishment in less time, as measured by a steeper vector on the graph. The traditional approach to moving from the solid vector to the dotted one? Well, most people try to do what they've been doing and push themselves to do more, harder, stronger, and longer. In other words, the thought pattern goes like this. Give me more to start doing, on top of what I'm already doing, that will change my perspective, and then someday the stuff that I can't stand will magically stop. Unfortunately, this approach just doesn't work. Instead, we want you to focus your work with us in a counterintuitive way to producing accomplishment. Instead of focusing on doing more of what you've been doing, we want you to focus on the things that you are doing that could be holding you back. Once you see those habits and make the choice to eliminate them from your game, our claim is growth happens naturally. So then, our framework looks like this. First, you see what you're doing that needs to stop, the 80% of your habits. Once you stop those, it frees up perspective and naturally allows for new practices to emerge. This is not a hard process to understand intellectually. The key is to be able to put it into practice in real life. We're going to give you the tools. Speaking of which, can you see what intervenes in the process of stopping the habits you have today? Right, risk. Giving up what you've been doing feels uncertain. It feels a bit scary. The devil you know is better than the one you don't. But let's think about risk for a moment. What is the risk of letting go of some of the habits you have as of today? Our claim? The potential for humiliation. Uh-oh, that didn't work. Well, the definition of humiliation is asking someone to act outside the interpretation they have of who they are. In other words, the risk that people are most afraid of is losing their current identity. But is humiliation or losing a bit of identity an actual risk? What we mean by actual risk is it life or death? Again, obviously no. But as a race on this planet, we have collectively lost perspective. How do we know this? Well, did you know that the number one fear in many countries across the world, when they take surveys of the general population, is public speaking? The number two fear? Death by burning. Think about this to its logical conclusion. This means that most people would rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy. As crazy as that sounds, the point is many people have become confused about risk, meaning that they cannot differentiate between actual and perceived risk, the former being life or death risk, the latter being the threat of potential humiliation. Unfortunately, when people cannot make this distinction, what happens is that they interfere in their own learning. Why would we say that? Well, because learning has the exact same definition as humiliation, asking someone to act outside the current interpretation they have of who they are. If, when faced with perceived risk, you default into your habits, you will end up producing recurrent situations in your life. So in a nutshell, here is why understanding styles is so critical. Pretty simple. The game of business is not a life or death game. Yet if you play it that way, where every time you experience risk you are worried about avoiding potential humiliation, your habits of protecting your current identity will constantly take over when you feel pressure and interfere with your learning. So in our model, step number one of the learning process is really becoming an observer. To better understand what we mean by becoming an observer, let's look at the first paragraph in the workbook together. What it says here is, risk impacts your biology. Think about that statement for a minute. We claim there are between 20 and 500 times per day where your biology is rattled. Whether real risk, God forbid, or perceived risk, potential loss of identity, your biology gets perturbed. When this happens, your heart rate increases, or maybe your blood pressure goes up, or maybe you're someone who has a tendency to sweat. The point is, we need you to start paying attention to when this is happening and what has happened in the environment to cause it. Why do we need you to do this? Well, look at that second sentence. This reaction is immediately interpreted in language as an emotion. What this means is that once your biology goes nuts, your conversations with yourself begin. And you begin telling yourself stories. We need you to pay attention to this language inside your head and see if you can identify the stories. Why? Well, again, look at the next two sentences. These internal conversations trigger certain survival habits of action. When observed over time, these recurring conversations and actions can be seen as a person's history. These are similar situations happening over and over to you, and the only consistent part of the equation is you're there. So now, just for a minute, look at those three words in bold in that paragraph. Biology, language, and history. These are the three areas where we need you to focus in, literally learning to watch yourself play in the game of business as if you were watching yourself from the outside looking in. That's why our definition of an observer is someone who is present outside their biology, language, and history to see how they are performing in the game, especially under pressure. Think about it this way. Becoming an observer is equivalent to a sports team having the discipline to watch film with their coach after the big game so that the team can learn to improve. In business, we don't have game films to watch, so we need for our clients to learn to observe these three areas of their business performance. If you make the commitment, using the Market Force Styles model will make you a better player. We understand that this concept of becoming an observer may feel a bit strange, but when you stop to think about it, so does anything you learn for the first time. That's why we want to show you briefly the progression of learning, which applies to learning in any domain in your life. The first stage of the progression of learning is unconscious incompetence. You may have heard this phrase before, a bull in a china shop. Well, a bull in a china shop can make no correlation between his own tail and the sound of breaking china happening all around him. So he just keeps moving forward even though he's the true cause of all the destruction. In a learning context, this is when you are oblivious to something. As you start learning, you move up to stage 2, which is conscious incompetence. This stage is the recognition stage, when at least you start to realize there is something to learn, and you begin to understand what it is going to take to get better. No real competence yet, but at least you're on the field of play. The third stage is conscious competence. This is when you are really starting to be able to apply some of the things that you are learning. Nothing is intuitive yet, but at least you understand a bit better what you're doing. In a sports context, this might be like a rookie on a sports team who needs some way to remember the plays because they're not intuitive yet. So he wears an armband with all the plays listed on there. He's in the game, he's a productive player, but his abilities are a bit more thought-oriented than natural. Finally, we get to stage 4, which is unconscious competence. This, in the words we used earlier, is when something becomes a habit, a practice, a part of your game. Your mind doesn't need to be as engaged. You are now to the point where you have learned in the domain and you can apply what you have learned seamlessly in the process. To that end, let's initiate now the conversation for styles. If you would, look at the second to last paragraph on the page there, where we make a serious claim that we want you to think about and be skeptical of. Namely, all animals, when faced with actual or perceived risk, respond with one of 4 survival strategies: to dictate, migrate, tolerate, or hibernate. This is a strong claim, and you should not just agree without thinking to yourself, are they serious? We are, and let's consider an example. See, winter is a real risk for most animals on the planet. And if you think about how winter is handled by different animals, well, you have some animals that dictate, like beavers, who reroute water with dams so that they can build their huts where they want them. Other animals migrate, like birds that head south to warmer climates before winter really hits. Still other animals tolerate, like buffalo who pound at the ground until they find that last blade of grass. And finally, other animals like bears hibernate through winter until spring comes. In each case, these strategies provide the best opportunity for these animals to live through winter. That's why we call these survival strategies. Well, we claim that humans are no different than any other animal. We may have it dressed up a bit better, but when pressed, all of us, including me, including you, including your clients, your friends, your family, have a reaction to risk that defaults to one of the 4 survival strategies. Now, we are different from other animals in that we do have language. As discussed earlier in the series, language is an invention that we developed, and to that end, one of the ways we use language is to justify our actions. See, people who have the automatic response to risk of dictating will tell others that what they are really looking for is more certainty, and the only way to get that certainty is to tell others what they should do. We call this style control. Next, for those of us who look to migrate when risk arises, we tell ourselves and others that we are looking for more freedom, so we must get out of this deal or out of Dodge entirely. We call this style influence. Next, for those of us who tolerate when pressure picks up, we justify our actions by prioritizing stability over any other concern. Hey, don't rock the boat. We call this style power. And finally, for those that hibernate when risk occurs, we do so in order to find security, like reviewing everything to the nth degree so that we don't make a bad decision. We call this style authority. Just to be clear, we do not expect anyone listening to this to be convinced of our claim. You should be skeptical and you should have questions about the validity of the claim. But you did agree to be a willing participant in the series, which means that you agreed to at least test out what you are learning to see if you can't see what we're saying. That means this week you should be willing to pick a meeting. Not your most important meeting, that's not the goal here, but pick a meeting and observe. How are you behaving? How are others behaving? Especially if the pressure in the room picks up. This is the best way to initiate yourself to your own habits of play in the game of business, and what it might look like to learn how to leverage your style, as well as let go of what's unnecessary to your success. Where we go from here is to start to look at your style and the style of others in more detail, so that you can be better prepared to coordinate more action more effectively in the future. And with that, we're done. Except for your practice assignments. We want you to be as happy as this gentleman is to work on your assignments this week, keeping in mind that they're designed to help you keep the learning alive. Please plan to complete your assignments no later than end of business the day before our next application meeting. We will look forward to that meeting. Thank you for listening, and now get back in the game.